Funding for Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff is provided by the Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff. Healthcare is the single largest sector of the American economy. Yet according to some experts, inefficiency and error plague the system. What's wrong? And what new options will soon be available to radically change the way healthcare is delivered? To find out, Policy Watch is joined again by Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., and the author of Saving Lives and Saving Money, Transforming Health and Healthcare. Now, the host of Policy Watch, Doug Besheroff.
Newt Gingrich, on behalf of the University of Maryland and the University of Maryland School of Public Affairs, welcome to Policy Watch.
Good to be here.
Let me turn our conversation now to the new Medicare bill. The new Medicare bill is complicated.
Sure.
And many people aren't policy wonks who study it and so forth. And so the first reaction is going to be, why did they make this thing so complicated for me? Except for saying, well, it had to be to get it through both houses and so forth. There's no other answer, is there? What else do we say except, yeah, it had to be kind of complicated?
A large part of the complexity is a response to the Congressional Budget Office scoring system. I mean, I think parts of the bill, frankly, are not very clever.
What are you thinking of? Like the donut?
But I also think, yeah, like the donut. But I also think you got to, you know, you end up in a summary judgment. Is this a right big step in the right direction? And do you now go back and fix it? Or do you say, no, this wasn't a big enough step in the right direction, let's kill it, and now you're back at ground zero starting all over again? I think this is going to do, starting with the $600 card for the poor this spring, starting with the 15 to 25% cut in drugs for everybody else who wants to buy a drug card, starting with the health savings accounts, starting with a variety of other things. There are a lot of pieces in this bill that are in exactly the right direction, and I thought on balance it was better to move that way, recognizing that it needs several more bills to finish the job, that this bill by itself is not adequate.
Implicit in some of the questions was the following thought. Well, this is great for younger people who are using the internet, Travelocity, who've heard of Travelocity. But my mother or my grandmother is 80 years old. She doesn't understand from computers. She's not going to be able to handle competitive pricing of drugs.
Well,
how are we going to help?
But presumably she's going to either have a doctor she trusts, a pharmacist she trusts, or somebody in her family she trusts. And presumably one of those three is going to help her.
You had some serious business to do to help this bill get passed. You were necessary, weren't you, to get the conservative Republicans on board?
Well, it's probably helpful. I mean, I think I've had a very long experience of working on health issues starting in the mid-1970s when I first ran. I had my first meeting on rethinking the health system in 1979 with Joe Parker of the Georgia Hospital Association. He was reminding me of this the other week. I chaired the Republican House Task Force on Medicare Reform when I was Speaker, the only time in history that a Speaker's done that. I've been working with AARP, first under Horace Dietz and now under Bill Novelli, for a little over a decade, which was at the time I first started doing it very rare for a Republican, but I thought it was, you couldn't get major reform without having the support of this is the second largest voluntary organization in America after the Catholic Church.
Now the Democrats feel a little double-crossed, don't they, by the AARP endorsement of the bill that was on the Senate floor.
Yeah, you know, that actually surprised me a lot from this standpoint. AARP had made a clear decision that they really wanted to get the best bill they could get.
But a bill.
But they wanted to get a bill. Now, that's a legitimate, honorable decision. I mean, you may agree or disagree, but it wasn't like AARP sold out. I mean, AARP forced the Republicans to back down on several conservative reforms and said, look, this is the box AARP can support. Now, this is the box the Republicans can support. There's this one zone here that fits both of us. And we either write a bill in this one zone or we're not going to get a bill. And I would say the biggest surprise to me, and I had worked on this for several years, was I thought when AARP endorsed the bill that if we could get the House and Senate leadership and the White House together and they could agree on a bill that AARP could endorse, I thought, frankly, you'd get 50 or 60 Democrats in the House. And I thought you'd get people like Teddy Kennedy saying, well, it's not everything I want, but it's a start. And instead, as you point out, I mean, the Democrats acted almost as though it was an act of heresy, as though AARP's obligation was to be liberal Democrat, not to be for senior citizens. And that's not the mandate AARP has. I mean, their mandate is what's right for people 50 years old and over.
There was not one House Democrat who voted for the bill?
No. We got, I think, 17 votes out of
17
Democrats.
votes?
But I would have expected 50 or 60. And the reason it was such a long, difficult vote that night is we knew if you're going to write a bill that AARP could support, you're going to lose 25 or 30 House Republicans because that bill's not going to have enough reforms. It's not going to be libertarian enough. It's not going to have enough change to satisfy the hard right. And that's what happened.
Now, maybe I've been in Washington too long. I'm going to put on my cynical hat here. And I ask myself, I say, I think the conservative Republicans are right. This is the proverbial camel snout under the tent. This is only the beginning. I've listened to Newt Gingrich. There are all these new drugs going to come, all these new fabulous treatments. We're going to include them all. This is a lot of spending.
I'm an optimist. I think health savings accounts, which apply to everybody under 65, and is a massive change. The biggest change in tax policy towards health care since 1943. Totally unreported. I mean, every person who's under 65 can go out now and get a tax-free savings account up to $2,500 per person, or $2,600 per person, and get tax-free buildup of interest.
And don't have to spend it just on health care.
No. You have to spend it on either health care, wellness, prevention, long-term care, or long-term insurance. And when you, but that's your money. So if you leave your current job, that savings account goes with you, builds up your whole lifetime. And when you pass away, if you haven't already spent it, it goes to your family as part of your estate. I mean, it is the biggest new incentive to recenter the health system back on individual responsibility, individual ownership, individual payments that we've seen since 1943. Second, the Medicare bill itself not only did the right thing, because it's the right thing to reestablish a drug benefit. I mean, in 1965, when we created Medicare, drugs weren't as important as they are today. But if we're going to say to you, once you're retired, we're going to take care of your open heart surgery, and we'll spend thousands for your open heart surgery. But by the way, we're not going to spend a little bit so you can afford the statin every month that will keep you from taking open heart surgery. There's something a little goofy about that. I mean, you have to really ask yourself, why would you want to keep this system that's kind of weird? So it's important to have a drug benefit. It's the right thing to do. This bill also, as we talked about earlier, provides for dramatic improvement in health management. It provides for a physical for every senior citizen at 65 to get a benchmark of what they need help with, what they should be managing, what they should be watching. It provides for coordinated care for the very seriously ill. It creates a medical savings account permanently in Medicare if you want one. It creates managed care options. It creates preferred provider options. So, and it does it on a permissive basis. If you like the current system and you don't want to change a thing, you are not compelled to do anything. This is not coercing you into joining a new system. It is giving you a range of choices. It's like visiting the Walmart of health and saying, I like aisle 3, I don't like aisle 5, I'm not going to go over to aisle 7, but I'm glad I have the right to choose. The general pattern of an entrepreneurial free enterprise society that has science and technology is you get more choices of higher quality at lower cost. I mean, if you go out and look at televisions this Christmas or cell phones this Christmas or microwave ovens, the general pattern has been now literally over and over again, you get more choices of higher quality at lower cost. But in the large bureaucratic systems, we block the kind of competitive energy and we block the kind of entrepreneurial talent that would create that range of choices. I mean, think about it. We don't have a model that says we're going to require everyone to buy a 22-inch television. We don't have a model that says we can only have one class of cell phones. And yet the sheer energy and drive and diversity of the market means that poor people in America have consistently led better and better lives. I mean, it's very, except for the cultural pathologies of drug addiction and alcoholism and those things, it's very hard to argue if you are not an addicted or a person with mental illness, it's very hard not to argue that people who are relatively poor in America are relatively better off every single year because the things that affect their quality of life keep rising as part of a general improvement in the society at large.
You touched, I want to go back to the drug bill, but you touched on something that I can't let us leave for a moment, and that is, except for certain behavioral aspects. We know, I think, that the most serious threats to health today are things like smoking, obesity, and other behaviors that are within reach of control by us. Now, you became famous or infamous for reforming welfare, which in effect was trying to tell people to change their behaviors.
Sure.
Is there some place in this debate for a discussion about the behaviors that lead to unhealthy results?
Absolutely. But I would draw two distinctions. The particular behaviors I described a minute ago are pathologies of such intensity that they deserve dramatically more serious response than we've been willing to give. And I got in some trouble when I first became speaker for saying, if you have a drug-addicted mother in a totally abusive situation, you would actually be better off to have the child having a better future. I heard a nun who runs the only program for young mothers in the Washington area that does not require them to have any money from the government, who commenting yesterday on the number of children that they take in who are newborns who are born drug addicted. And now, my argument was, this is a serious pathology. This is not detox the child and hand them back to the mother to be beaten to death by the latest boyfriend. And that we're not prepared to recognize that there are some neighborhoods of such pathology, that we should be thinking about those neighborhoods in a much deeper, much more serious way than we're willing to. Now, that's a very narrow focus, but that's for people who are in enormous pain and leading lives that are terribly limited by their experiences. Now, when things like obesity and tobacco and diabetes, we absolutely need better public policies. I mean, we should have a public policy that says that we should reinstitute genuine physical education. I mean, from K through 12, you ought to go to real physical education. And the reason is, you now have a generation of 12, 13, and 14-year-olds who are obese and who are rapidly acquiring diabetes. I mean, we're getting adult-level diabetes in 12-year-olds. Well, this is a long-term catastrophe for this country. There's no question in my mind we ought to be thinking about making sure that you have full disclosure on the meals you buy. So if you go to a fast food place or you go to a restaurant, I mean, I think it's absolutely unavoidable.
So it's time for a National Institute on Healthy Behavior.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. And by the way, the people at Nestle's changed the way we wrote our book, because we went and visited their labs, which are near Lausanne, Switzerland. And they have 150 researchers who study nutrition. And their focus is on what they call probiotics as opposed to antibiotics. That is, if you eat real yogurt, for example, you're adding to your tummy a whole range of bacteria. It turns out that 70% of the cells in your body don't belong to you.
Right.
There are bacteria that are in your digestive tract that are delighted that you're walking around as sort of a warehouse carrying them. They think of you as a wonderful warehouse to live in. But their point is, there are three things to focus on: nutrition, activity, and attitude. And if you manage those three, it is amazing how less often you'll get sick. And so we shifted from what we had talked about as a patient-centered system to an individually centered system to make the point that our first goal is to keep you healthy enough that you don't need to become a patient. My in-laws gave me a digital scale at Christmas. I asked for it because I decided I was getting too old to keep messing around. Just the act of knowing I'm going to get back on the scales, and the digital scale, for me at least, psychologically helps, because if the needle's wavering, I can't figure out what's going on. But if a number is staring me in the face, if it's an absolute number staring you in the face, it's just humiliatingly more difficult. And it absolutely has changed my behavior at the margin. I mean, I'm very slowly losing weight on a regular basis, because I may have one night where I go out and live it up, but then I have 5 or 6 days in a row where I'm going, I got to get back down here, and that was a really vivid example to me of how much compliance has to become internalized with us. It can't be the doctor, it can't be the nurse, it can't be the hospital, it can't be the government. They can do things to facilitate it, they can do things to encourage it, But in the end, people are going to have to learn, just as they did in the welfare bill, people are going to have to learn to be responsible for their lives.
So let me take this in a slightly different direction. You implied that some kind of prescription drug benefit was all but inevitable, right? Here's where practice is, here's where the law is, they had to be brought together. Right. And there are a number of areas like that, right? Here's where Social Security benefits are, here's where the baby boomers are, somehow that has to be brought together. We haven't exactly talked about the interstices of Medicare, but as you know, the hospital, whatever is one of the Part B, is slated to have deficits as large as the entire Pentagon budget out in 30 years or whatever. So we're in a situation in which various pieces of what have become the American social welfare state have to be reordered. And I take it there are two competing models out there. One, keep going the way we are, even if that means raising the percentage of GDP that goes to taxation for these programs from the current 22-ish, federal 30-ish, including the states, to a European model of 40 or 48%, versus trying to do something now that maintains a smaller federal profile. Is that the battle of the next few decades?
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is how do you get enough economic growth? Because if your economy grows dramatically, it's amazing what you can do and not notice it. I mean, it's a lot like a person whose income goes up fast enough that they can buy a bass boat and it wasn't a big bite out of their income that year. So I would say the central domestic challenge in that sense is, can we meet the reform requirements or the transformation requirements of the baby boomers and their children? And can we keep the economy growing fast enough in an increasingly competitive world market? The Europeans, I think, are failing on both counts. They have a structure which is increasingly out of sync with the world market and which makes it harder and harder to hire Europeans. I just talked to one company which is closing its office in virtually every European capital because it's just too expensive to hire people in Europe anymore. They're going to outsource everything because they said it's not worth the effort. And I think that's a real challenge to the Europeans. And then second, the European political system behaved exactly as you just described. They cannot cope with the crisis of their welfare state, particularly on the pension side, to a secondary extent on the health side. And as a result, in France, in Germany, in Italy, you are seeing just horrendous problems financially. And I think they're likely to get worse, not better.
If those kinds of changes are inevitable, is that why we're talking about compassionate conservatism? Does he see this need?
You know, this is a country where idealism has beaten cynicism for most of our history. I mean, I think this is really a remarkable country. I think that President Bush, to a remarkable degree, understands that the changes that are coming are really big, and that small things won't make much difference. I keep telling people that if you really want to get back to a balanced budget, and I have some standing on this because I helped write the only 4 large balanced budgets since the 1920s, you got to do 3 things. You have to have the economy growing dramatically. You have to either win the war on terrorism or contain it at a fairly low threat. And you have to transform health. Now, health savings accounts, if they're adopted as widely as I think they'll be, are going to be an enormous source of capital. Because if you start getting people putting away $2,000, $2,500 a year tax-free, that's going to go into a savings account of some kind or an investment instrument of some kind. You're going to create suddenly a massive wave of additional savings that are going to be out there. They're going to help fuel economic growth. That is also going to convince people, I think, that, and I think this is part of why the Democrats, once they understood it, the liberal wing got so frantic. If you start having 10, 15, 20 million health savings accounts, you are, on top of having IRAs and 401ks, you're going to start having an acceptance of the desirability of a personal Social Security savings account, which will substantially shift this country in a direction of more savings, more investment, being much more of an investment-oriented society. If this is the last step, then the hardline conservatives were right. If this is the first step, then Teddy Kennedy was right. And I think it'll be interesting to see when the president comes back with the State of the Union, whether or not we have continued new ideas, continued new approaches. in health. I think we will have, and I think it's very important. And let me just mention one last example that should trouble every American. The greatest threat to this society is an engineered biological weapon, probably based on flu, not on smallpox, because flu is much more dangerous than smallpox. The 1918 flu epidemic killed more people than the First World War, and did it in a year. Mm-hmm. We are just watching the vaccine makers run out of vaccine this year for a relatively mild flu. We today have...
With 4 months warning.
With 4 months warning. We today have no technology available to mass manufacture the kind of vaccine you would need if we were hit with an engineered biological. And one of the most important areas for the National Science Foundation and the NIH, National Institutes of Health, to work on is to use nanoscale capabilities to really rethink how you could literally grow from the ground up a molecular-based vaccine that you could mass produce in a rapid basis. This is an example of why there will be really large changes in the next 10 years, because the science is beginning to be available, the threat certainly exists, and a smart government is going to get ahead of the threat by investing in the science before the crisis occurs.
What do you tell the president's people should be on the plate for next year or the coming years? What's the next proposal? We're not going to wait 4 or 5 years.
Well, I think one of the most important steps you raised yourself earlier, and that is to have an initiative to shift the compensation system in Medicare and Medicaid towards wellness. I think a second one ought to be to rethink what we mean by disabilities. We live in an age when almost everybody has some capability. And if we had a capability approach to help people who have disabilities live full lives, it would be both a better way of life and ultimately, I think, less expensive. So those would be two examples of where I think we have to go next.
Newt, before we close, the conversation we've had tonight, I would say, is many times more informed and more thoughtful than the political discourse we've had for the last few years about a Medicare reform and a prescription drug benefit. And I'm troubled by that. And I'm wondering what's wrong with our political system, that it's only extremes, and we don't have this kind of discussion. People don't have to agree with what you said tonight, and many people in the audience, as you could tell, sharply challenge your views. But I think we'd all agree that we had a discussion. Have I missed something on the Hill in public discourse? Is there this discussion taking place and it's just outside of the public eye among politicians?
No, a lot of it's in the public eye. It's just that it's not in the news media eye. I mean, if you were to go and look at the total number of Ways and Means or Senate finance hearings on health that are really smart, where really first-class people come in and testify, and where members sit there for hours and ask. I mean, Nancy Johnson chairs the Health Subcommittee of Ways and Means, and Nancy Johnson knows a tremendous amount about health. Bill Thomas has spent over 20 years of his career working on these issues. He knows an immense amount about health. Bill Frist is a world-class heart transplant surgeon. I mean, he's probably the most remarkable person to be at the Senate Majority Leader slot while writing a health bill. You know, these are not stupid people. They're not shallow people, and they're not extremists. But the news media doesn't cover it. I mean, if you have a rational, calm, intellectual dialogue about a positive idea, it is boring. You know, and if you have to match that against the Lacey Peterson murder case, or against a basketball star having sex at 3 in the morning, or against Michael Jackson's plane landing, it's very hard to convince the editors of Modern News that multi-year generational decision about the quality of health for every American somehow should rival whatever the latest tawdry, trivial, entertainment-based piece of trash is. And so, you know, and even for the great newspapers, I mean, we have a lot of great newspapers in America. It's very hard for them to cover substantive issues. But if you read, you know, Robert Pear in the New York Times, the truth is he's a very knowledgeable writer, and he writes very knowledgeably. Now, that's not what gets covered, you know. And I spent a large part of my career as speaker with people coming up and saying, you know, the version they got in 12 seconds on the evening news was so different than the version they got in 90 minutes in a dialogue. And they kept wondering why I was changing. And I kept trying to say to them, well, you know, if I get to pick the right 12 seconds out of this evening, you know, I could make me look either really great or really dumb, depending on which bias the editor has, you know. But I think you'd be very pleased with the fact that there are an awful lot of smart people who work very hard every day on the congressional staff, the Senate staff, the White House, and other places, who know a lot and who are trying to find solutions.
And should we worry that that conversation isn't getting to the American people?
I think anytime you decide you want to see it, just go to C-SPAN. Or go to the Thomas system and pull up the text because it's there. It's made available for everybody for free. You know, I mean, I'm an optimist. This has always been a rough and tumble country. You know, George Washington, late in the spring of his fourth year as president, wanted to retire and not run for re-election because the New York newspapers were attacking Martha for holding high teas, and they thought it was a sign that she was trying to make George into a king. And he was so angry at the idea that after having gone through the Revolutionary War, gone through the Constitutional Convention, agreed to serve his country, that they would attack his wife in the newspapers, that literally Jefferson and Hamilton had to get together and beg him to run for a second term because they thought the country needed the stability. It's a great story. It's a true story. So I start with the premise that if we live in a society where even Martha Washington could be attacked, it shouldn't surprise us that it's sometimes cluttered and a little hard to see the big picture.
Well, on that very positive note, on behalf of the University of Maryland School of Public Affairs, Newt Gingrich, thank you very much.
Thank you.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content. Funding for Policy Watch with Doug Bescheroff is provided by the Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation.
We are PBS.